Hey friends, Chubby Meeple, back today with another Kickstarter preview. Today we're going to be taking a quick look at Empire's End. This is designed by John D. Clair, published by Brotherwise games, and featuring the absolute, always gorgeous artwork of Kwanchai Moriya. I mean, just look at that box cover, it is stunning. We're going to jump to the table, I'm going to give you a quick overview of how the game plays, and then I'm going to come back here and give you my thoughts, and tell you kind of what I like, what I don't like, those kinds of things about Empire's End. In Empire's End, each player takes on the role of a civilization at the peak, or the height of its glory, if you will. Throughout the course of the game, those civilizations are going to be inflicted with several disasters throughout the game. That could be in the form of a flood, a fire, famine, whatever the case may be. They're going to be determined by this disaster deck. We'll talk about that in a second. The gameplay itself is fairly straightforward. You're simply going to be moving the time marker one square at a time through each of these little squares that you have on the board, and as you enter a marker, or as you enter a square, the icon in that square will determine the type of phase that you're going to be playing, whether it be a disaster phase, an economy phase, an innovation phase, or an industry phase, or a conflict phase. Once the time marker reaches the end mark of the track, final scores will be tabulated, and the civilization or the player with the most points will be declared the winner. What you're looking at here on screen, I have a single civilization set up here. This game's 2 to 4 players. Each player's area will look very similar to this. At the start of the game, you're going to have 11 locations in your city, or in your civilization. These 11 locations will be randomized by the first player, and then all other players will place their locations in the same order, so that everyone will start with the same setup in terms of locations and their adjacency to one another, which can play a role as the game goes on. But as the game goes on, things will get swapped around, will cause things to get destroyed, and the layout of everyone's civilization will change very drastically as the game goes on and people start taking disasters. Each player also begins the game with 2 of each resource, 2 hammers, 2 axes, 2 wheat, and 2 coins, which act as wild resources. Each player will receive 2 disaster markers, as well as 4 disaster cards, which will help add innovations to their city. You'll shuffle the disaster deck, as well as the conflict deck, place those near the board within reach of all players, create supplies, which I've created off camera, of the axes, hammers, wheat, and coins, as well as a supply of exhaust tokens, or exhaust markers. Players' point markers are also set next to the scoreboard, which is represented by the score track outside of the continuation or the phases track that you see here. Once that's done, you're ready to begin. Play will begin with the first player, indicated by this little first player marker here, and we'll proceed clockwise around the table until the hourglass marker reaches the end, in which case we'll tabulate the final scores and move from there. To start the game, you're simply going to move the track to the first phase, and you will process that phase. The first phase in every game is always a disaster phase, and in the case of 3 or 4 player games, which is what we're looking at here on this track, you'll notice some of the spaces have these little dual columns on them. These are dual disasters, where during the disaster phase, instead of bidding on a single disaster, players will be bidding on 2 disasters at the same time. In a 3 or 4 player game, especially in the 4 player game, there are a lot of double disasters that players will be looking to resolve. Probably the easiest way to explain and break down the gameplay is to look at each of these phases individually and how they work, so we can piece it all together at the end. The first phase we will look at is the disaster phase. In the disaster phase, the top card of the disaster deck, or in the case of a double disaster, 2 cards would be turned up. But the top card will get turned face up and placed where all players can see it. In this case, we have a plague. Now, there are several things on this card. The plague is the type of disaster. The number here, number 3, this is the location counting from the left. So counting from left to right, this is the location that this disaster is going to target in every player's civilization. So this particular plague is targeting location 3. So each player will count 3 spaces from the left. In this case, we have this 5-point army, and they will place one of their little fire markers on it to indicate that that location is targeted. For the purposes of this video, I'm laying these down on their side. When we've played the game in the past, we generally will stand them tokens up, so they're kind of 3-dimensional off the table. But for the purposes of the video, I'm going to lay them down so that you can see those. You also have a couple of resources that are shown here. In this case, axes and hammers. Those are the two resources that players will be able to use to bid to not take this disaster into their civilization. The bottom part of this card down here that says military and then has some iconography is an innovation that will be gained by the city or the civilization who takes this disaster, and that can help. It basically mimics your civilization adapting to that particular disaster they've taken. It gives you essentially a bonus or power that you'll be able to use throughout the rest of the game if you do happen to take this disaster. So the way bidding is going to work, this card gets turned up. We'll just place it here for now. Everybody is bidding to not take the plague. This is a secret bidding. One thing I don't have on camera here, there are player screens that will keep all of the resources hidden, so players do not have, may have an idea, but they won't have an exact count of how many resources each of their opponents has. So the way bidding is going to work is beginning with the first player. They will determine whether they want to take this disaster, pass, essentially. You can pass the bid and take the disaster, or you bid to not take it. In this case, you can bid either hammers or axes, with coins being able to stand in for either, because they are wild resources. So let's say player one here doesn't want to bid, or doesn't want to take this disaster right now. They would throw a hammer or an axe or a coin out here to bid and say, no, I don't want this disaster. I'm gonna bid on it. It will go to the next player, and this will continue going around the table with players throwing axes and hammers and coins on this as it goes around the table, until one player decides they either, first of all, they can't bid on it, they don't have any hammers, axes, or coins, or they just decide that they want to take this disaster, they don't want to bid anymore. So let's say we've done that, we've gone around the few table, and I know I did take resources from down here to throw up here just to kind of symbolize that. These resources would come from other players. But anyway, if we get back to the first player decides, you know what, I'm going to take this disaster, I don't want to bid anymore. They're going to do 4 different things. The first thing they're going to do is they're going to claim any resources that were on that disaster and add them to their resource pool. They are then going to take the disaster, and they're going to, first they're going to take the disaster in location 3. So we have location 3. Their location 3 tile is going to get flipped over to the backside. So this is what a healthy location looks like. It gives you some benefits down here. We'll talk iconography a little bit later. Give you some victory points if it's healthy at the end of the game. The name of the particular section of your civilization, and kind of faded out here is the number of hammers it will take to repair this location. What happens when you take a disaster is this gets flipped over. You'll notice the score is now crossed out, and your hammers are more visible. You also don't have an ability down here because now this location has been destroyed by that disaster. So we flip that over, and that gets destroyed. Location number 3 is destroyed. You can return your disaster marker back to your supply. Then the player who took this disaster has the choice to place this disaster under any location in their city. And so if they wanted to, let's say in this case, this iconography means I'm going to get 1 conflict strength for every adjacent destroyed location that is next to this particular innovation. So maybe we want to just place this plague right here in slot number 4. It's going to slide under the location so that you can still see all of the iconography. And now when we get to a conflict phase during the military, you're going to have you'll get extra combat strength because this is adjacent to a destroyed location, as long as this is still adjacent to a destroyed location by the time the conflict phase or the military phase rolls around. The fourth thing you're going to do, so you take the resources on the card, you destroy the location, you place the innovation that you got for the disaster card. The fourth thing you're going to do is, if you do not already have it, you will take the first player marker. You'll be the first player to bid on the next disaster. In the case of a double disaster, it works exactly the same. The difference is that players will have 2 disasters on the table to bid for. So in this case, we have locations 7 and 8. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 would be the targets. You bid exactly the same as you would, except on your turn, you have to determine at the same time, you basically have to resolve both disasters on your turn. So you're not going to bid on one, it go around the table, and you be able to bid on the other. In this case, the flood targeting 8 and the revolt targeting location 7, I would determine how I want to handle that. So I could put a wheat here and a hammer here on my turn, then it goes to the next player in clockwise order who would do the same. Or they could choose, players could choose to possibly, I could take, if this had, wheat and hammers on it and I didn't have any hammers in my supply, I could choose to take this disaster, gain the wheat and the hammer, and I could move this hammer over here onto the other disaster. So you're going to be resolving your disaster cards simultaneously as they go around the table. The person who takes the second disaster will take the first player marker, but all other aspects as far as taking resources, destroying the location that matches the number on the disaster card, and placing the innovation still work as normal, just as they do in a single disaster phase. The next phase we will discuss is the economy phase. The economy phase is this green square with 2 gold coins in it. During the economy phase, players are going to be collecting resources mainly, but there also could potentially be innovations that allow them to refresh spaces that are exhausted. We'll talk about exhausted spaces in a little bit. During the economy phase, you're going to look at your civilization and any spaces that have the economy keyword. So you'll see this particular location says economy and has the picture of an axe on it. So in this case, this player would gain an axe, a hammer. This would allow them to refresh any exhaust markers in adjacent locations. We don't have any right now. This location allows the player to trade a wheat for either a hammer or an axe, and they can do that up to 2 times. There's another refresh, and then there's a wheat. So at the start of the game, or not start of the game, but in this economy phase, this player is going to get a wheat, an axe, a hammer, could refresh locations if they had adjacent ones that had exhaust markers, and then with any wheat they have up to 2, they could trade up to 2 wheat for either a hammer or an axe, any combination. So that's the economy phase. It's a very quick phase, basically gives you resources to be able to prepare for the next disaster phase, or to even be able to prepare for industry or innovation phases as they happen. The next type of phase we're going to discuss is the industry phase, or the innovation phase. You'll notice the next 2 bits on the track here are disaster phases. You have a single disaster, and then either a single or a double disaster based on whether you're in a 3 or a 4 player game. And I should point out now that when it comes to the double disaster phases, the double disasters only show up in the 3 or 4 player game. In a 2 player game, every disaster phase is a single disaster, and there are 5 fewer rounds to play as well. We're going to skip over these disaster phases because we've already discussed those. We're going to move to this industry phase, signified by this gray box with the hammer in it. During the industry phase, players are going to repair damaged locations, be able to build new innovations from their hand, and be able to activate any brown abilities or any industry abilities that they have in their civilization. One option players have to do during the industry phase is to repair damaged locations. So our damaged or destroyed locations. So we have this army location here that is destroyed, and we could repair it now during the industry phase. Now, we don't have to necessarily do the repairs before we do any of the building innovations. We can build innovations first because they may assist us with repairing, and I'll show that in a second. But in order to repair a damaged location, a player simply needs to pay the amount of hammers shown on the card. In this case, 4 hammers would repair this army. So they would pay that back to the supply. So this player has 2 hammers and 2 coins, so they would be able to repair this if they wanted to. And that would simply flip this back to the healthy side, regain your 2 military for the conflict phases, and get you the 5 points back on this healthy location. So you can pay the hammers to repair. Additionally, during the industry phase, you can build from your hand. Your hand of cards are essentially disaster cards, but in terms of building these from your hand, what really matters is this bottom part of the card, because they're going to give you different things. You may have some things that give you more economy, some things that give you end-game scoring, some cards that allow you to exhaust to create an ability, and then some industry phase bonuses as well. Each of these cards, when you build these cards, are going to cost you 1 hammer. So if I wanted to build this flood card here, in order to give myself this innovation. Now, it's important to point out that when you're building these cards, I don't have to destroy location 11 to build this card, because I'm building the innovation as part of the industry phase, as opposed to gaining the innovation because I took a disaster. So that's a very important distinction to make. But if I want to build this into my civilization, I would pay 1 hammer for my resources, and that would go back into the supply, and I would be able to take this flood card and place it anywhere that I would like in my civilization. It's important to note that I can, if I wanted to, I could choose to build this innovation under this destroyed location here, but when the industry phase rolls around, if this is in my civilization under a destroyed location, I will not get to activate it. You can build it there, but doing so might hurt you because you won't be able to activate it. But there could be cases where it makes sense to build there. So, build the flood. We would pay a hammer back into the supply, so I'll put that back in the supply. And let's say I want to build this innovation here. And the reason I would do that is because the icon on here lets me repair adjacent locations for 1 less hammer. So now I would be able to repair this location for 3 hammers instead of the 4 that's printed on the location card. It's also important to note that during the industry phase, you start the game with 3 cards that give you, or 3 locations that give you powers during the industry phase. One of those locations allows you to swap the position of 2 locations in your city. So if I didn't want my 2 towns right together, I didn't want my 2 farms together, I'd be able to swap those locations. Any locations that swap that have innovations attached with them, so if I were to swap this farm to move it away from this other farm, this industry innovation that's been attached to it would move with it. Everything moves together and stays attached to the location that it was added to. So I can swap that. The other 2 locations that you have here let you build an innovation for 1 less hammer. So I took this hammer away in order to build this location, or this innovation here. I would not have to do that. As long as these locations are healthy and they're not destroyed, I get a 1 hammer discount on building 2 locations, or building 2 innovations. During the building of innovations, you have to build 2 innovations, or you can choose, if I don't want to build one of these, I can choose to sell one of these back to the supply, basically, or kind of discard this to get a coin. So you're going to pick 2 cards from your hand. You're either going to spend hammers to add those 2 cards to your civilization. You could sell those 2 cards to get a coin for each, so you could sell them for 2 coins total, or you could build one and sell one for a coin. But you're always going to do 2 cards in your hand. And since you have 2 locations that give you a 1 hammer discount, you'll essentially be able, as long as these locations are healthy and not destroyed, you'd be able to build your 2 innovations for free. So this one would be built for free because I have to pay 1 hammer for it, but I get a 1 hammer discount for this location. So this one gets built for nothing. The second card that I play, and we'll use this disaster card here, this famine, I'll say we're going to play that, would also normally cost me 1 hammer. But I get a second 1 hammer discount and can use that to play here. So I'm just going to slide that under here. It does not have to be built into the location that I used the hammer discount for. I just chose to put that there for demonstration's sake. Now, one thing to point out, some of these innovation cards have an icon here above the phase that has a little plus hammer symbol. This means that in order to build this particular card, I have to spend an additional hammer. So if I had chosen to build this particular innovation into my city, even though I get the 1 hammer discount, I still have to pay a hammer from my resources in order to build this, because this costs 2 hammers instead of 1 to build. It's also important to note that even though you get 2 hammer discounts between your 2 locations, assuming they're healthy, of course, you cannot use both of those discounts to build the same card. So I would actually have to pay a hammer for this using 1 discount. You can only use 1 discount per card that you're building. So that's an important distinction there. After you've built your cards, you will have 2 cards left in your hand. You then have the choice to discard those 2 cards, keep those 2 cards, and then you'll draw back up to 4. If you choose to discard, you discard both cards. There's no you can't just discard one and keep the other. You're discarding none or discarding both is the distinction, and a special rule there. And then you'll draw back up to 4 cards, so each player will always have 4 innovation or disaster cards in their hand as the game goes along. That is the innovation phase and what you'll be doing in that. I just want to show a couple of examples of some of the phases. So these cards will identify what phase they will activate during. We've seen the industry phase would allow me to pay 1 less hammer to repair this. So I could pay 3 hammers here and repair this army so that I could have my military strength back for the conflict phase. This card would activate during the military phase. And what this card says is for each adjacent destroyed location, I get 1 more military strength. So by repairing this, I cost myself the 1 military, but this one's worth 2, so it's probably a better idea to do that. This particular card activates during the disaster phase. And what this card means, you'll see this little gray square with an arrow, and then it says no wheat. What this means is if a disaster card comes out during a future disaster phase, and this card is in my civilization under a healthy location, if the disaster card has wheat as a cost that I can build on, so let's say this famine card came out, and you can only use wheat to bid on this card, I could, for my first bid or any bid during the phase, I could place an exhaust token on this particular card and be able to bid wheat without actually putting wheat from my supply on top of this card. So it is a way to basically get a free bid of that round, as long as the resource on the disaster card matches one of the resources pictured on the disaster that you're bidding on. And so then if it comes back around to me and I were to bid again, then I would have to actually bid wheat and put wheat on the card just like normal. And there are several of these cards throughout the game that will allow you to do the same thing for hammers and for axes as well. You will also have innovation cards that trigger during the economy phase. So when we get to those economy phases that gather your resources, you have the potential to build innovations that do things during the economy phase. This particular card will give you 2 points during every economy phase. You'll get 2 points for every adjacent destroyed location next to this innovation, so that you can score points for those destroyed locations as the game goes along. So these might be cool cards to build at the start of the game when you have more economy phases to go through. And then finally, you'll have cards with end-game scoring. At the end of the game, you'll score victory points based on a certain resource. In this case, you get 2 victory points for every axe that you have in your supply at the end of the game. So not counting printed axes on the cards themselves, it's literally what you have in your supply. And in this case, this will not count coins as axes. This will only count the axes themselves, because there are cards that give you points for having coins at the end of the game. And that is the innovation phase. The final of the 4 phases to discuss is the conflict phase, or the military phase. And that is shown by this red square with the 2 crossed swords. When a conflict phase occurs, the top card of the conflict deck will get flipped up for all players to see. And players will be essentially bidding their axes to determine their military strength in order to score victory points, gain resources, and avoid consequences of having the lowest military strength. At the start of the conflict phase, when the card gets flipped out, everyone will see the card and break it down. I'll show that in a second. But before bidding begins, every player will count up and announce to the table and to other players what their starting military strength is, their starting conflict strength. That is determined by the number of swords that you have in your on your healthy locations within your civilization. In this case, there's an army here that provides 2 swords. There's an army here that provides 2 swords for a total of 4. If this particular location were adjacent to a destroyed location, so if this army or this town had been destroyed, this player would get an additional sword, so they would be at 5. But both locations adjacent to this card are healthy, so this will not come into play. So this player starts with 4 combat strength. Of all of the other players will make an announcement as well. Then at that point, players will bid any number of either axes or coins that they have, because again, coins can act as wild resources, except for in-game scoring. You can bid any number of axes or coins, and of course, because there's a player screen generally here that keeps this information, your number of resources hidden from other players, you do not have to announce how many axes you can potentially bid. Players will only know what your starting strength is. Players will then bid a number of axes or coins. So they'll take the resources they wish to bid with, they'll put them in their hand, put that fist out in the middle of the table, and once everyone's ready, they will reveal, and everyone will count up their total combat strength, adding the axes to their starting strength. In this case, this player would have a combat strength of 6 because they started with 4, and they bid 2 axes. Any axes that got bid, or coins, would get returned to the supply and removed from that player's resource pool. Why do you want to bid axes? Well, what you're trying to do with the conflict is you essentially don't want to be the lowest. There are different point tiers that you see here in the center of the card. In this case, you have an 8+, a 5+, and a 3-. Depending on where you come in with the tiers, with the point tiers, and how much military strength you come into this conflict with, you will score or lose a number of victory points and could potentially gain resources as well. So for this case, this player that we had in our example started with 4 military strength, bid 2 more, had a result of 6. So they come in at this 5+ level because they are at 5 or more military, but they did not reach the 8. So in this case, this player will get 5 points and gain a hammer. So they'll get a hammer back from the supply, and they'll gain 5 points. We'll just say they're the yellow player. We'll move their point tracker up to the 5 on the score mark there. Any players who got 8 or more military strength would score 8 points and get 2 hammers. It's important to note, let's say a player got to 9 strength. They would only get this 8 points and 2 hammers. They would not get the additional 5 and 1, even though they were above the 5 as well. You only get 1 tier. Except for the person who bid the most. Whoever bid the most or who had the most military strength, or players that were tied for the most military strength, end up getting the victory condition in addition to whatever tier they're in. So if this player who had 9 gets this and also happens to be the most, they will get an additional 4 points and a coin. So for a total of 12 points, 2 hammers and a coin if they had the most military strength. Then, once that is determined who the winner is, who had the most strength, and everyone has collected for their tiers, or in this case, if you have 3 or less military, you'll actually lose 2 victory points. The next thing that happens is upheaval. And what upheaval will happen to every player at the table who was not the victory of the combat. So in a 4-player game, you're going to have one person that has the victory, that gets the victory condition. The other 3 players are going to have to suffer upheaval. And what upheaval is going to do is it will have you swap either the first, second, or third highest valued healthy location into a certain location. This particular upheaval has you swapping the first, so your highest value healthy location, with location number 7. So what that looks like is, right now all of our locations are healthy, so our highest one is going to be our 32-point city that is currently in location 10. Because we were not the highest, we only bid 6, there was another player here that did 9 in this example, we have to swap this city with location 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So this particular road and this city will swap locations. Again, any innovations that had been attached to either of these locations would move with that location. And this is how, this is one way that everyone's civilization starts getting jumbled around. And even though you start with the same setup, things will get moved around. And so in the future, when location 7 gets targeted by a disaster in a future disaster phase, now it would target my 32-point city, where the victor of this particular combat did not have to swap, so their 14-point road is all that's getting targeted by the disaster. So it starts to affect the way locations in your city are being targeted by the disaster. So if my 32-point city is being targeted, which costs 12 hammers to repair if it does happen to get destroyed, I may be more willing to bid more resources to keep this location healthy, whereas if someone's location 7 is a 5-point army, they may be willing to take it because it's only costing them 5 points in a couple of military conflict, whereas 32 points is a lot of points to lose when you get to the end of the game, because you'll only score for your healthy locations. So that is the conflict phase. You're going to do your points, score for your tier, score the victory points for whoever has the most, and then everyone else will do the upheaval. And then you'll simply move to the next phase, and you will continue going through these phases until the hourglass reaches the end of the track, at which point you would do final scoring. One thing I want to point out, in a 3 or 4 player game, I already mentioned that the 3 and 4 player game has the double disasters, which do not exist in a 2-player game. One other difference of the 3 to 4 player board, in addition to being 5 turns longer than the 2-player game, is that there is a space as you get toward the end. There's one space here that is split between industry and economy phases. In that space, players will simultaneously do both phases, industry and economy. They will choose to do those in either order they wish, and that's an individual decision. So player 1 could choose to do economy and then industry. Player 2 could do industry first and then do economy. You do those in any order you choose personally for your civilization and what works best for your game so far at that point, and then you'll proceed to do the other phase. The caveat is you can't begin one phase, start the other phase in the middle of it. So I couldn't start my economy phase, take axes and hammers, stop my economy phase to do industry, and then go back to my economy phase. You have to select and complete one phase before you move on to the other phase. Let's take a look at final scoring. If this were the end game condition for this particular player when the time marker reached the end track on the field or on the board, we would enter into end game scoring. The way end game scoring works is each player will be on the board. We'll throw these player markers out here as well, so that they're out here. So the players will have scored points throughout the course of the game for things like scoring points during economy phases. It's the main way you're going to score points, is getting points during the economy phase as you move around the track, and then also those winning those conflicts. The other end game scoring that you're going to get, you're going to get additional points for 2 things. First, your healthy locations, so those locations that are not destroyed, and then any innovations that you've built throughout the game that give you end game points, that have an end game phase on them, that are not below destroyed locations. They're only the ones that are under healthy locations. So this particular card here gives 2 points for every axe that the player has in their supply. This player has 2 axes and would score 4 points. However, this location that this innovation is attached to is destroyed, so they do not get those 4 points because this card is essentially null and void based on the location it's attached to being destroyed. So we look here, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Looks like 5 of our locations are healthy at the end of the game for a total of 11. Plus 5 is 16. Plus the 9 gives you to 25, 3 gets you to 28, and another 20 gets you to 48 points. So this player is going to go from 30 down to 78. They will then also score points based on their end game cards. So again, we already discussed this end game card, 2 points per axe not being valid because it's in a destroyed location. However, this particular card gives us 4 points for every adjacent farm that is healthy. This isn't a farm or healthy, so it wouldn't score us anything. However, we do have a healthy farm, so this player will score 4 additional points for having that. Then we come down here. This particular card gives you 3 points for every adjacent destroyed location. So there's 2 destroyed locations, which will give them additional 6 points. That card's already null and void. And then this card is the most destroyed locations. At the end of the game, if you have the most locations destroyed, you get 13 victory points at the end of the game. This player has 6 destroyed locations. Unfortunately, there is a player off camera who has 7, and so they would not score these 13 end game victory points, ending their score at a total of 88. You would do the same final scoring for the red and green players in this case, and whoever has the most points is the winner. In the event of a tie, the winner is the player that is closest to the current first player traveling clockwise around the table. So if the first player, if one of the tied players has the first player marker, they would be the winner. If they're not one of the tied players, whoever's closest to them in turn order would be the winner. And that is everything you need to know to play Empire's End. So that is Empire's End by John D. Clair, Brotherwise Games. This game is, right out of the gate, I'm going to say it, this game is punishing. There are so many disaster rounds and disaster phases throughout the course of this game that you're going to have to be bidding, and it makes the resource, kind of that economy of resources, incredibly tight because you have to bid on these disasters so often throughout the game, especially in a 3 and 4 player game, more so in a 4 player game because you have so many of those double disaster rounds that happen in a 4 player game. In a 3 player game, you still get double disasters, which is obviously far more than you get in the 2 player game where there's not a single double disaster. The 3 player game, you still get some double disasters, but there are some spaces that in a 3 player game are single disasters instead of doubles, whereas in a 4 player game, all of those spaces are dual disasters. So it is a very punishing game. That being said, that's the theme of the game. Your civilization is under constant attack from floods, fires, barbarians that are pillaging you. There's all kinds of things that are happening. The entire theme of the game is you are at the height of your civilization and now all of this crap is happening to you and you have to manage it the best that you can. So by design and fitting the theme, the game has to be punishing so that you have that feeling of your civilization just constantly being punched down. Now, whether that's a game for you, whether that's a theme that's going to be fitting for you, is going to be for you to decide. Personally, I enjoy it. It did, the first time I played it, I felt like, wow, this game just absolutely hates all of its players, and it's a miserable feeling because I can't get ahead. Every time I've collected some resources, whether I've built up my economy phase really well, and I've collected a lot of resources that way, or I've taken a couple disasters, but it went around the table a couple of times and I was able to get some resources that way. It's disaster time again, and those resources are going right back out, so I don't have the resources to use for other aspects. I've bid all my axes to survive disasters, so now I don't have axes to use during the conflict phase. Or I've bid away all my hammers during disasters, so I don't have any hammers to use during the industry phase to repair locations. So you really have to, the first time I played, I felt like there's just no way you can get ahead. I'm getting punched in the face every single turn. There's brief reprieves for economy and industry phases here and there. But for the most part, the game's just constantly punching you and kicking you while you're down. However, upon future plays, I realized that not only is that the theme of the game, your civilization getting chopped down at every opportunity, and so that fits the theming of the game, but it really means that you have to be really thoughtful about bidding for certain disasters or whether you want to take those. Because, yeah, you may not want to take that disaster because it destroys a 20-point city for you, but if you bid to pass that disaster around, you're throwing away hammers that could be used to repair your 32-point location. Or I'm bidding axes away so that I don't take this disaster that will destroy my 32-point location. Or I want to keep those axes for the conflict phase, because if I end up going into conflict and I have, most of the conflict cards are 2 or less. So if you go into conflict with 1 or 2 power, 1 or 2 total combat across your locations, and you don't have any axes to bid, you're going to be losing victory points. And in the rule books, it states that you can go into negative victory point territory. So it is possible to end this game with a negative victory point at the end of the game. Now, that being said, I've never seen that happen. I've never seen someone end this game with negative points. I did have one game where someone had negative points at one point, but was able to pull out and finish with a positive score. The art is beautiful. It's Kwanchai Moriya. Anytime his name is attached to anything with art, you know it's going to look absolutely stunningly gorgeous. Even the disaster cards that have, the locations on fire, yes, it's bleak and it's disaster and it's dark, but the cards themselves are vibrant with the bright colors of the flame and everything. So I really like that. Can't really speak much to component quality because, of course, this being a prototype version, this is prototype quality components. What I have here, very playable. I mean, the card, the won't dive into card stock and all of that, but everything I have here is very playable. I imagine that the Kickstarter is going to be even more so. You'll probably see, who knows, with Kickstarters these days, you always see deluxeified components, so I wouldn't be shocked to see metal coins, addition for wooden style resources, those kinds of things. This is me speculating. I'm not saying that all the Kickstarter is going to have those things included, but generally Kickstarter, publishers love to do deluxeified versions for Kickstarter, or give backers the option of getting deluxeified resources, deluxeified coins. I don't know if we'll see a neoprene mat with this. I don't know that it necessarily needs it. I would like a neoprene mat with this for each player to have. To hold their locations, simply because sliding those innovation cards, if you're on a hard surface table and you're not playing on a game mat, a game table that has a game mat, if you're playing on a hard surface table in a coffee shop, the first game I played this, we were playing in a restaurant/bar, and we didn't have a mat that we were using. It was just the hard surface table. It can be a little tricky to slide those cards under the locations, whereas if each player had their own neoprene mat to put their locations on, it would make those cards much easier to slide because you'd have that give with the mat. So personally, I would love to see a neoprene mat option, at least for the player spaces, not necessarily a big mat that everyone uses and shares. Just give each player their own. That'd be great. Not really sure what the storage would look like on that, but this is just me rambling at this point. Overall, I really enjoyed Empire's End. I feel like, yes, it's punishing. If you don't like punishing games, if you don't like games where you feel like the game is constantly punching you and kicking you and not letting you get ahead, if you feel like you have to, if you don't like having to scratch and claw your way to victory, this may not be a game for you because it is very much in your face and hitting you with those disasters. But like I said, that forces you to be thoughtful about your decisions. It forces you to decide, do I want to sacrifice you take this disaster, sacrifice this 14-point location simply because I need access for conflict and we're getting ready to come into the conflict phase. You can see on the board, we're getting ready to go in industry phase. I know I'm going to need hammers to repair some of these things. Maybe I want to take this disaster that's out now, save my hammers so that I can repair later, and also have hammers to build additional locations during that industry phase. So I really like the balance of that. At 2 players, it feels less punishing because you only have, every disaster phase is only a single disaster. You never have a double disaster. And I feel like the double disasters are where it really feels bad, because you could take 2 disasters in one round or one phase. Where you just won't have that happen in 2 player. I did find 2 players to be, I prefer it. Let's just say I prefer it more at the higher player counts at 3 and 4. 2 players, it's good. It works well at 2 players. There's no changes to the gameplay other than flipping the board over to the 2-player side of the phase track. But when you're talking bidding and you're talking auctioning, not really auctioning, but you're talking bidding. that bidding always works when you have more players, and that's true in this case as well. The bidding works better at 3 and 4 than it does at 2, but the game certainly plays well at 2. I didn't dislike it at 2 players. I definitely encourage you, if you want to check this game out, it'll be hitting Kickstarter the 29th of November if you're seeing this video before then. If you're seeing this video on or after the 29th, the Kickstarter's probably live right now. There'll be a link to it in the description of this. You can head over there. You can hit up brotherwisegames.com, kickstarter.com, search for Empire's End as well. Feel free to drop comments below. I'll answer those to the best of my ability. And until next time, keep gaming, friends.